All right, I'm going to call to order the October 8th Waxhaw Board of Commissioners work session. We have two items on the agenda: pay benefit and classification study report and the executive search firm RFP for the town manager position. We'll get right into the business part of it, and I'll call Wendy up to introduce the topic. Yes.
Okay. You all know Susan Manning. She was the consultant that we brought in to do the salary classification study. I think she can explain more. We're almost at the end. I mean, the actual final end after tonight, or today, so we'll let you. Okay. There you go.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I appreciate the opportunity to work with the town on this important project, and just a little bit about myself so you know who's talking to you today. I'm a retired HR professional. All of my work experience in human resources, almost 30 years, was in public sector human resources. I worked for the state of North Carolina for a number of years, and then I finished my service with 13 years as the Director of Human Resources for Mecklenburg County. And when I retired, after about a year, I started doing consulting work, and I do HR consulting work for small to medium-sized municipalities and nonprofits, and I've been doing that for 13 years. So I've done a lot of projects in the Mecklenburg, greater Charlotte region. So some of my clients have been, I think I've done projects for all of the small towns in Mecklenburg except for Mint Hill. I've done projects for Indian Trail and Belmont and Bessemer City, and so just to give you an idea of, I've worked with a number of municipalities in this area. So I'm here today to give you some, share with you the findings and recommendations from the Town of Waxhaw's classification and compensation report. And I have time for questions at the end, but obviously as we go along, if you want to stop me and ask questions, I'm happy to take your questions at that time. So without further ado, whoops. See which way this goes. Well, what did I do?
There you go.
There it is. So I met with Wendy and the acting town manager at the time in July, and they asked me about conducting a study. And the purpose of that study was to conduct a classification and compensation study to ensure that your job descriptions and your job classifications were up to date based on your organizational structure in order to maintain internal equity, and also that your salaries, your salary ranges, and your benefits were competitive with the external market that you have to compete in when you are hiring and retaining staff. So that was the purpose. And doing this, let's see which way this goes.
Try that one.
This one? Okay. Yes. So our goals, once I understood what you needed me to do, our goals were to update your job descriptions, make sure those jobs were classified appropriately according to current duties and responsibilities, reporting relationships, and so forth. You had some changes organizationally within the town, and we needed to make sure that that was reflected in your job descriptions and your classifications. We also wanted to ensure that your salary ranges and the benefits that you were paying to staff were competitive in the market, because we're in a very hot labor market, and it's been a challenge to recruit and retain staff in that very competitive market. Also, we wanted to be sure that you were paying employees competitively within their salary ranges based on their qualifications, and the major reason to do that is to improve retention, because if you're paying them competitively with the market, they're a lot less likely to go elsewhere to look for other jobs. And finally, we wanted to develop an updated classification and pay plan for the town to ensure internal equity and market competitiveness. And this is to give you a foundation to build upon in the future, because the market will continue to move, and you need a good solid foundation to administer classification and pay going forward. So those are the goals. And why do the study? I've done a lot of these studies in the last 3 years, and that is primarily because the market itself, the labor market, is moving very rapidly. It's very dynamic. We have wages have been increasing an average of 3% per year on average. Unemployment, the latest unemployment statistics just came out last week. It's down to 3.5%, and that is a 50-year low. So longer than I've been working in the public sector, believe it or not. We haven't seen unemployment this low, and with a smaller labor pool of available candidates, it's the economics of it that tends to drive wages and benefit costs up. Finally, your last pay study was done in 2015, so that was 4 years ago, and with the market moving an average of 3% a year, you can see that's about 12 to 15% that the market itself has moved over the last 4 years. So it can be very easy to get behind, even if you're doing what Wendy has been doing and what you all have been supporting, which is to adjust your pay scale every year and to give appropriate salary increases. The market also doesn't move uniformly. So for each job class, the market is a little different. And right now, the challenge is, particularly in the public sector, to be able to hire and retain police officers, because fewer of them are going through basic law enforcement training, and so hiring and retaining police officers is a challenge. Planners, also a challenge. I think you've had about 100% turnover in your planning department, so that probably comes as no news to you. And then also public services and public works positions. Any class that deals with construction and maintenance right now is in high demand in the market just because of the growth in this area. And for those jobs in particular, you are not only competing in the public sector for those jobs, but we're competing with the private sector for those jobs. So that gives us some additional challenge. And then we obviously wanted to take a look at your pay and benefits plan as it compared to other local government employers in the area, because for some classes like police officers, in particular planners, public sector is the primary marketplace that you're competing for that talent in. So the key dates from the study, I think we had our initial project meeting the end of June. I began the classification study first, which is in our HR methodology, we typically begin with classification, get the foundation of your jobs and your job classes in place, and then we do the compensation study, and that's the order that we did this study. July 9th, I met with all the department directors to get their input and hear their questions and concerns at the beginning of the study. And about the middle of July, we sent out the salaries and benefits survey to the communities in this market that we wanted to gather data from. And in August, I spent most of the...
When you say communities, what do you mean by communities?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
If you'll hold the question, I'll tell you exactly who we surveyed.
Okay.
August, we did data compilation and analysis for salaries and benefits. In September, I had a meeting with Erskine and Wendy to share results, and then we finished up the employee salary and costing analysis the end of September into this month, and that brings us to today, where we're going to share the recommendations. So the classification study, again, looking internally now at your jobs, we have updated all those job descriptions to reflect duties, responsibilities, reporting relationships. I did an analysis of your Fair Labor Standards Act designations, whether positions are exempt or non-exempt, what the minimum required qualifications are, and that your job descriptions are in a consistent format. We looked at how jobs or how functions are allocated across the organization, and one of those that I noted and have talked with Erskine and Wendy about going forward is code enforcement. Right now, that was part of the engineering department. Now that your planning department is a separate department, it might be appropriate to have that code enforcement responsibility under the planning director, which is often where it is organizationally. Right now, it's under, it's combined with your downtown development director position. And that is an interesting marriage of enforcement activity and business promotion and development. Those types of things typically don't go hand in hand. There's not anything wrong with the way you've got it allocated, but this is something for the future that perhaps you might want to think further about as you hire a new town manager and consider some things like that. The chief building inspector also does code enforcement for the building codes, so that's another potential place that you could combine your other code enforcement activities. Your administrative assistant classification is used town-wide, and I just wanted to reinforce that the need to do that consistently in these recommendations, and that's something Wendy and I have already talked about. And finally, there were only 2 changes in your Fair Labor Standards designations. One would be to move your police lieutenants from non-exempt to exempt, meaning they would not be eligible for overtime if they work more than the number of hours for law enforcement, public safety officials. And that's because they would qualify under the managerial exemption under the statute. And the systems administrator position, now that position has been reclassified, is also eligible to be exempt under the computer exemption under the law. So those were 2 FLSA changes that I recommended. Some of the other findings and recommendations, and this is just a list of individual positions. Some of these are title-only changes. Some of these are also salary grade changes. The assistant finance director to senior accountant, the auto mechanic supervisor to fleet maintenance mechanic. That position really doesn't supervise anyone, so moving that away from a supervisory title I think is more appropriate and in line with the actual duties and responsibilities. The fire marshal is a new position, new classification for the town, and based on the market data, we needed to move that to an appropriate salary grade for that function. Downtown development manager, which we've also talked about, again, moving that to an appropriate salary grade. Park and Rec program coordinator is a new, not a new position, but it's a new classification as you are looking toward adding more programming in your Park and Rec department. And finally, aligning your Park and Rec technicians that do maintenance work out in the parks with your maintenance workers in public services. Those jobs are very similar. Align those together, and recommending your maintenance worker 1 and 2 be realigned to one class of maintenance technician. So that affects the public services department. And finally, your town clerk. The assistant to the town manager role is now being combined at Erskine's recommendation, and certainly my support doing the study to combine the assistant to the town manager and the town clerk since you lost your previous assistant town manager just recently. The other thing that I wanted to recommend, part of the findings and recommendations, was to eliminate some job classes that you're not currently using. Again, the maintenance worker 1 and 2 would be combined into a maintenance technician class. You have an animal control officer, and I'm not suggesting you get rid of your animal control function, but that work is actually conducted by a sworn police officer because it's not a full-time job, and the person also does other police officer duties. Most jurisdictions that have a separate class for animal control officers are using non-sworn staff to do that work. So it's fine to use your police officer to do that work, but we ought to classify them as police officers because you require them to be sworn. Your public information officer function is contracted out now, so you don't really need a classification for that. Planning and zoning administrator is consolidated with your planning director. Your code enforcement administrator is currently being done by your downtown development director. and you do not have an assistant town engineer or a safety coordinator. So since we are not using those classes, I'm just suggesting that you kind of deactivate those classes. They won't show on your classification plan unless you need to reactivate them in the future. Finally, just suggesting, because of the size of your department and how duties are allocated, that we consolidate your planner 1 and 2 levels into just one planner class. So you will have a planning technician, a planner, and a senior planner class in your planning department, which is in line with other small jurisdictions of about your size. So those are all of the recommendations and findings that were strictly classification related. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about compensation. But before I do, any questions about anything that I have presented to you today that you would like to ask me about before we move on?
Questions? Just, you said at the beginning, we did it 4 years ago. What are you seeing in the market as in terms of how often you do these kinds of studies to stay competitive?
A good question. When the market is as hot as this market has been, you need to do it every 2 to 3 years. 3 years is absolutely the outside, and really probably best to do it every other year. Now, if the market slows down again, you can stretch it out to more like 3 or 4 years. But right now, the market's moving so fast, and it's very expensive if you get behind to catch up. It's easier to stay current. So
Charlotte and Raleigh are unique in how they're growing versus
yes,
everything else too.
absolutely. There's a big difference between the major urban centers in North Carolina and the more rural parts of the state. And really, Charlotte and Raleigh are the big drivers in the labor market for the state of North Carolina.
Thank you.
Anything else on classification? All right, we'll roll on then. So that was the first part, or phase 1 of the study. The second part was the compensation and benefits survey to look at how Waxhaw's pay and benefit plans compare to the marketplace. I mentioned we sent out a survey, and we surveyed 16 benchmark communities in the greater Waxhaw, Union County, Mecklenburg County region. Of those, 14 of 16 responded to the survey. That was 88%, which is a good response rate. We included 39 of your job classes in that survey, and I think that was over 90% of your job classes. I think there were only about 3 or 4 jobs that we did not include in the survey. And we try to keep the number of job classes under 40 when we're doing a survey, because we rely on HR directors like Wendy to take time away from their regular duties to respond and provide data for us. So if it's too long, it's hard to get people to respond. So we try to keep the number of classes that we survey to around 40. We had 18 benefit questions that we included, everything from what kind of health plan do you have, what kind of vacation do you offer, how many holidays do you offer, as well as things like do you pay for certifications for education or special certifications that might be required by police officers and other classes. What kind of tuition reimbursement program do you have? So the full range of benefits we ask people to respond to. And finally, I also use supplemental data from the League of Municipalities, which does an annual survey statewide every year, and the Main Street Salary Survey, because you have a Main Street program here in Waxhaw, and we wanted to look at the data for the Main Street program directors. So that was kind of the source of the data. And to the question that you asked, Mr. Mayor, here are the 16 communities that we surveyed. And we tried to pull communities from the surrounding areas that you really are competing for talent in the same labor market. So Gaston County, Belmont, kind of across the river from you, all of the small towns in Mecklenburg, the 6 small towns, Fort Mill, which you're very close to, they're just across the state line, but again, in the greater, it's still considered part of the Charlotte regional labor market. Harrisburg in Cabarrus County. We did pull one community from Raleigh to get a sense of that Raleigh labor market, Holly Springs, which is one of the small towns outside of Raleigh. Indian Trail and Stallings, which are in Union County, as well as Monroe. Monroe's larger than you, but they're a major player in your labor market, just like Charlotte is a major player in the Mecklenburg County labor market. So we surveyed them, also Union County. The two that did not respond out of this list of 16 were Mount Holly in Gaston County and Mid Hill in Mecklenburg. Everybody else responded. So we got lots of good data. So I wanted to talk a little bit about market methodology with you. So what is the data that we were asking these communities to provide to us, and how do we use that data to calculate a market rate to determine whether we're competitive with the market? So we ask each community for those 39 benchmark job classes, we ask them to provide us the average actual salaries being paid for each benchmark position. So for a position that is a single incumbent, like your finance director, they just gave us the actual salary that they pay their finance director. But for police officers, where they may have a number of employees in that one class, they provided us the average actual for all the salaries they pay to their police officers. We asked them to provide the number of employees that they have in each position and the salary range for each position. So we're looking at average actual salaries that they're paying, as well as the minimum of their salary range, the midpoint, and the maximum. And the way we use that data, so that was the salary portion, and then again we asked them to respond to those 18 benefit questions to tell us about what benefits they are providing to their employees. So to calculate a market rate, which is what we use to determine if we're paying competitively with the market, we calculate that by using an average of the actual salaries being paid in the market. So for each of these 14 jurisdictions that we responded and had a similar position to Waxhaw, we took all of those actual salaries being made and being paid, and we averaged those to come up with an average market rate. We also look at a median, the median being the 50th percentile. 50% of the people pay above, 50% pay below. Usually the median and the market rate are very close together. Another thing that we do with that data is we do an adjusted market rate for some classes to exclude outliers. And so what would an outlier might look like? It particularly comes into play when you look at director positions, management positions, particularly when you're one of the smaller jurisdictions in the survey, when you look at those different jurisdictions that we surveyed. So, so what we do in that situation is we often throw out the high and the low of those for like director level positions, where you might have, if you compared the finance director for the city of Monroe with the finance director for the city of Waxhaw, you're going to see a big difference in terms of size and scope of that job, just because Monroe is much larger and has more employees. Same thing is true for like the police chief. But for rank and file employees, like maintenance workers or police officers, we typically don't need to throw out those highs and lows, because the work is very similar, whether you're doing it in Waxhaw or you're doing it in Monroe or you're doing it in Union County. So another time that we might exclude a particular data is if we feel like there's not a good match. So you can't just go by titles when you're doing salary surveys, because different jurisdictions are organized a little differently. They may be using a title one way when we would be using it a different way. And so we actually do provide, in addition to just our titles, a description of how that job functions for Waxhaw, and we ask the HR people to match to the appropriate title for their job. And sometimes we have a great match, and other times we can tell by looking at it that there's not a good match, and if that's the case, then we might exclude that as an outlier. So for each of the, I believe we had enough market data to calculate a market rate for 28 of your 39 job classes. And when I say that, you want to have at least 7 or 8 different data points in order to calculate a valid market rate. If you have a class where you only have 2 respondents, it's very difficult to say that's a representative sample for that job in your labor market. So we had 11 job classes where we didn't get sufficient data, and that's when I used the League of Municipalities data. And that essentially gives us a lot more data sources for similar sized communities in North Carolina as the town of Waxhaw. And then we also used the Main Street data when we looked at your downtown development director. So when we added in all the data, we were actually able to calculate valid market rates for every single one of your 39 job classes.
Can you give an example of one of the 11, just you didn't have enough from the the communities that you had to go to?
Downtown Development Director is a good example because everybody doesn't have a Main Street program or have a job, an economic development person. So that's
a good
an
example,
example, yeah.
Thank you.
Fire marshal was another one. So a lot of counties have fire marshals, but a lot of cities have fire departments. So there wasn't always an exact match for those. So we had to gather some additional data. So once we calculate a market rate, how do we compare and to determine if your range or your salaries are competitive with that market rate? And what we are aligning to is we take the average market rate should align to the midpoint of your salary range. And so for the town, you have a minimum salary and a maximum salary, and we actually calculated the middle point of your range and aligned that to the market rate for each job class to determine if you're paying above the market, below the market, or competitive with the market. And because that's just a calculation, that average, we actually look at more what we call a market range. So it's plus or minus 5% of the midpoint of your range. And you really want the midpoint of your range to be within that plus or minus 5% of the market if you're going to be competitive. So that's kind of how we do the methodology. And I should say that this is not just my methodology. This is a best practice in human resources. Virtually all of us do salary studies the exact same way. So, whether it's me that's doing your work or you use a firm to do it, we follow a very similar methodology. So, let's talk about some results. So when we looked at all the data, calculated the market rates, and compared it to the midpoint of your salary ranges, 16 of your 39 job classes were deemed to be below market, meaning you were paying lower than the market. The range was lower than the market. That did not necessarily mean you were paying the employee below market, but the range itself was below market. And that was the first thing we wanted to do, is to look at your pay plan structure and make sure that structure is competitive with the market. And then second phase is to go back and look at how you're paying your employees. So 16 of the 39 job classes were below the market, and that's about 41% of those job classes that were surveyed. 8 were at the market or competitive with the market, meaning they were within that plus or minus 5% of the market rate. And then 13 of the job classes were above market. Sometimes they were only above market by a very small amount, and sometimes they were a little further apart from the market. And 2 of the job classes are currently contracted, your town attorney and your communications position, so you don't have a range for those jobs to really compare them to. But I was asked to survey them because if you ever decide to bring those jobs back in-house, so to speak, and hire someone as an employee, you now will have the market data, so you know how the range should be set for those jobs, if that makes sense. So these were the list of job classifications below the market. I'm not going to read all these off to you because I know you've got a copy in front of you, but most of your director positions were below market. Their ranges were below the market. That did not mean, again, that you weren't paying your directors competitively. In some cases you were, and in some cases you weren't. Downtown Development Manager, Recreation Program Coordinator, which is a new position, Senior Planner, and so forth. There were several of your police positions that were below market that were your detective, your sergeant, and your lieutenant. The job classifications that were competitive with the market, one of your directors, your Park and Rec director, was competitive. Your events manager in Park and Recreation, staff engineer, admin assistant, town clerk, code enforcement, Park and Rec facility supervisor, and your police officer. I'm going to mention this when I get to.
That's the patrol, right?
Yes, your
Yeah,
patrol officers,
okay.
correct. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but when we particularly look at police officers, because as I mentioned, that's one right now that's very difficult to hire and retain people. And typically for police officers, you're hiring police officers at the minimum of the salary range. So you have to make sure that you're competitive not only at the midpoint or the market, but you have to be competitive at the minimum. And in your case, as you will see in the recommendations, the police officer was competitive at the midpoint, but not at the minimum. So one of the recommendations was to move that range as well. And finally, the classes that were above market, there's a whole range of those, ranging from your assistant finance director to that animal control position I mentioned. Two of those classes really are not market issues. They're more how you have the positions allocated. The animal control officer is really a police officer in your class. I was a bit comparing apples to oranges because most of the people that responded in the survey, their animal control officers are non-sworn positions. So that's why if you don't use that class, that removes that class as an issue, even though you probably will still designate a police officer or two as you need them as your animal control positions. And then the park and rec and events assistants, they actually are covered under your admin assistant class, and that class is competitive with the market. So there are really only 11 that are a little bit above the market. There were 5 of these that were enough above the market that I felt like it presented an internal equity issue internally within your organization. And I actually recommended moving those ranges down a little bit. That did not affect the salary of any of your incumbents in those job classes. It just meant it reduced their range a bit. So that affected 5 positions. I believe those 5 were the assistant finance director, the fire marshal, which is a relatively new position, your planner, which we were combining Planner 1 and Planner 2, your Park and Rec technician, which we're aligning with your maintenance technician for internal equity purposes, and your police captain. The others were all very close. They were a little high, but not enough so that I felt like we needed to move their ranges.
So is it safe to assume then the P&R technician becoming a maintenance technician, that classification would go away then too?
Well, I'm actually going to I'm just suggesting, because that position functions in the Park and Rec department, that you keep that title,
Okay.
but they will be in the same salary grade.
Okay.
And so we'll have similar qualifications and the same
Okay.
rate of pay. So once we determined which of these ranges we needed that were, how competitive your ranges were, then we needed to look at how you were actually paying your employees within those ranges. So that's the next step of the analysis that we did. And we didn't just look, of course, at what you were paying your employees, although that was certainly something we were looking at, but we also needed to look at the employees' qualifications, because how you're paying your employees goes back to how experienced they are, by the education, years of experience in the position, how long they've worked for the Town of Waxhaw, and a variety of factors like that. Because sometimes an employee may be being paid at the minimum at the range, and that's perfectly appropriate because they may be a brand-new employee and just meet the minimum qualifications. But in other cases, you may have a very experienced person, and they may not be being paid competitively within their range. So that was what this analysis was designed to do, was to let us know where we might need to adjust some salaries to be sure we were paying them commensurate with their education, experience, and qualifications. So if the employee salary was at the midpoint or above, they were already being paid competitively with the market. So no salary increase would be recommended under the study. If the employee salary is below the minimum of the new range, we're moving the range, now the employee salary falls below the minimum, then we want to move that employee to the minimum, so at least they're within the minimum of the new range. And then finally, if an employee is qualified above the minimum for the range and their salary is below the midpoint or below the market, then based on their qualifications, we might need to make an adjustment to give them what we call a market adjustment to move them closer to the midpoint. So that's the analysis that we did, the data analysis and the employee analysis, and that brings us to findings and recommendations, but I'll go back and talk about benefits a minute before we do that. You all had asked it that we also not just look at salaries, but we look at this from more of what we call a total compensation perspective. We want to look at benefits and salaries because benefits are a significant part of the cost to you for maintaining a well-qualified workforce. We had 18 questions. I'm not going through every one of those 18 questions with you, but I will say that in doing the analysis, I found that overall your benefits are very competitive in the market. And I wanted to give you a couple examples of those just to talk through. And because they're competitive with the market, I'm not recommending that you make any changes. So in some cases you were a little above the market, in some cases you were below the market, but for the majority of your benefits you're right on target, competitive with the market and with your competitors in the market that you're competing against for talent. For holidays, as an example, the town offers 13 holidays in addition to the standard holidays. You give the employee birthday off and a personal holiday. And so that's a little bit more creative and it would be considered a little more competitive in the market because you're doing some extra things for your employees to make them feel valued and appreciated. Dependent coverage contribution is another that you're paying 60% of the cost of your employees to cover their dependents. The market's probably right around 50%, but in Union County, you're competing against Union County employees and the city of Monroe, and both of them pay more than you do for dependent coverage. So you're staying competitive in your local labor market, which is something that's a good thing to do. You did away with longevity pay in 2007, so the only employees that receive longevity pay for the town of Waxhaw are those that were hired before 2007. And a lot of jurisdictions, local government jurisdictions in this region still provide longevity pay. So that's an example of a pay that you're a little behind the market on. Bilingual pay is becoming more and more common in the marketplace, particularly for police officers that are having to deal with citizens that may have a different language from English as their primary language. And so a lot of police departments in particular, but other classes as well, jurisdictions are offering bilingual pay if they have to use the second language as part of their duties and responsibilities. You do not currently provide that benefit. And finally, for employee recognition and appreciation, I've got to take my hat off to you. You all are doing a very good job in that area based on the things that Wendy shared with me that you all do to recognize and appreciate your employees. And some jurisdictions do similar things, but you all are doing some things that are different from other jurisdictions. And that's great because typically that's non-monetary recognition, which is really important to employees as well as being paid appropriately. So So those are some examples from the benefits findings and analysis that I wanted to share with you. And if you have particular questions about the others, I'm happy to address those as well. So let's go back to compensation for the moment. And these are the findings, and then from these findings, I will draw my recommendations. So you might remember that it was 41% of your ranges were below the market, but if you add in those few job classes that we did not survey, and we essentially looked at those in the context of the other jobs, about 38% of your ranges are below the market. Most of the salary ranges are only below market by 5 or 10%. So again, when you think about how much the market has moved since the last time you did the study, that's a tribute to you all and to Wendy and her work that you're not further behind than you are on most of your salary ranges. There were a very few that were off by 15 to 20%, but that was literally 2 or 3 ranges that were off that much. As I mentioned before, your police officer range is competitive at the midpoint, but not at the minimum, which is a problem since we're typically hiring police officers at the minimum, and they tend to turn over in the first 2 or 3 years that they join us. So it's really important to get that range, that minimum range up at a competitive point. Some employees are not being paid competitively with the marketplace based on their qualifications and proposed salary ranges, and several employees are now being paid below the minimum. So we're going to address that in our recommendations. But first let me talk about the police officers, since I'm recommending you move that range because your minimum is low. This sort of shows you how you compare with other small jurisdictions, other jurisdictions in this marketplace that we surveyed. And you can see that other than Monroe, y'all are second from the lowest in the list. I didn't list all 16, but this is a good representative sample, and y'all were second from the bottom. And what I'm seeing in terms of the salary surveys that I'm doing broadly in this market, you need to be about 40,000. Your minimum needs to be about 40,000 if you're going to be competing with other jurisdictions for this very small labor pool of qualified police officers. So that's one of the reasons I'm recommending that we move that range. So the pay plan recommendations, one of our goals was to develop a new pay plan for you based on the market data. So we will be structuring a new pay plan around these new market rates that I've mentioned. Your minimum of the range will be 80% of the market, and the maximum will be 120%. That gives you a 50% wide range from minimum to maximum, which is kind of a best practice. That's probably the most common range that we see in local government. I'm recommending that you maintain a salary range midpoint rather than just an open range from minimum to maximum. If you have an established midpoint in your range, it's much easier to keep up with how competitive you are in the marketplace because, again, that market rate aligns to the midpoint. So that's something Wendy and I've talked about. Each salary grade has its own range, and there's a 5% differential between salary grades, which makes it easier to administer when you're calculating promotional increases and things like that. And finally, we allocated about 42 or 43 of your job classes to the pay plan based on the closest market rate that we had for that job. And we also recommend, or I'm also recommending, that you merge your law enforcement salary ranges into the town's pay plan rather than maintaining a separate plan for police. I think you actually had 2 different ranges for some of your police classes, so it gets very confusing as to which range you're using, not to mention how you're keeping those ranges competitive when the manager brings the budget to you. So it will be easier, and I think the police chief is on board with this as well, to have your law enforcement classes merged in with the rest of your civilian classes. So the compensation recommendation, so that's the pay plan structure itself, the
Wendy?
compensation.
Wasn't the police salary stuff a byproduct of the old study done by the COG in trying to address some of the competitive exposures?
At that time, it was part of their,
From
career development.
career development?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what that,
Yeah.
where that came from. That's where that originated from.
And I'm not suggesting that you necessarily get rid of your career development plan, you just
Bring it together.
you're just bringing it together, yeah. So the compensation recommendations are as follows. You had 16 benchmark positions that were below market, so I'm just recommending that we adjust those to bring them within the market range for their jobs so that they will be competitive. As I mentioned, there are 5 ranges that I felt like needed to be reduced slightly because they were significantly above market. There were 8 other ranges that were slightly above market, but with the market moving as fast as it is, I didn't want to bring all those ranges down because the market continues to move. But there were 5 that I felt like were high enough, significantly above, that they needed to come back a little bit in order to be equitable. Adjust the police officer range by 5%. When we do that, the minimum salary now moves from 38,1 something to 40,102. And again, you get kind of over that threshold of $40,000 per year, which is really where you need to be if you're going to be competitive when hiring new police officers. We want to increase the salaries for employees whose salary fall below the minimum of the new range, and there actually were only 3 of those that needed to be adjusted to the new minimum. And then award market pay adjustments to employees whose salaries are above the minimum but below the market commensurate with their qualifications. And this addresses this issue of paying your people competitively within their range, and also helps you avoid pay compression at the lower end of the range, which can sometimes happen when you move ranges up. If you don't move people commensurate with that range movement, then you just pull everybody down to the lower end of the range. And again, that makes it much more difficult to retain employees as well as to hire new employees. Finally, if employees were already being paid at the midpoint of the above for their job class, they're being paid competitively with the market, so there really was no reason to recommend salary increases for those employees. So this tells you exactly how many people are affected in each of these classes. Part of the classification study that I wanted to go back to, just under your standard existing personnel policy, if jobs are reclassified, they should be eligible for a reclassification increase, and there are 2 employees that would be eligible under existing town policy for reclassification increases. The 3 employees, as I mentioned, were being paid below the minimum of the salary range that they were in. We either moved the range slightly, and then that threw them below the minimum, or they were already below the minimum of the range and needed to be brought up to the minimum. 33 employees are being paid below the market based on their qualifications and are recommended for market adjustments up to 5%, including 8 that will move to the midpoint. So if an employee was very close to the midpoint of the range and well qualified for the job that they're doing, by that I mean they had 6 or 7 years doing that kind of work, either for the town or related work from another jurisdiction, then they should be fairly close to the midpoint of their range. So if they were less than 5% away from the midpoint, we moved them to the midpoint. If they were more than 5% away, then we typically recommended up to a 5% adjustment commensurate with their qualifications. In some cases, we had some internal equity issues with existing salaries. So in some cases, employees are recommended for less than a 5% adjustment, because if we had given everybody a 5%, it would have created some internal equity issues with other similarly qualified employees. So there is a little bit of variation, but the average increase, market increase, was 5%. And that was also the average of range movement that we moved the ranges was 5%. So again, trying to keep those things in proper alignment. So when all is said and done, 38 employees are recommended to receive a salary increase as a result of the study, and about 32 or 33 employees are already being paid at market or above and are not recommended for a salary increase at this time. And also within that 33, I believe there are certainly a few employees that are being paid below the market that should be being paid below the market, meaning they're either a brand-new employee that has just been hired and they have minimal qualifications. They meet the minimum requirements for the job, but they are not qualified beyond that. So there are a few employees that are not recommended for increases because they're being paid appropriately with their qualifications. So that brings us to the implementation cost. I've understood from the earlier conversations I had with management that y'all were interested in doing a mid-year recommendation and already had money in the budget set aside for this. So I first calculated the cost of all of these increases on an annual salary basis, because year over year, that's what you will have to build into your budget for the next fiscal year. And the annual salary increase cost, if all of these recommendations are adopted, is $94,120 in actual salary increase cost. And then because when you move the base salary up, there's increased cost in retirement, increased cost for 401k contributions, and increased cost to your FICA contributions. So with those things, we factored in about a 20% increase for the additional associated benefit cost, and that's around $19,000. So the total annual cost is right at $113,000 a year. If we implement November 1st, that's 8 months of the 12-month cost, and so that takes the total cost from $112,944 to a proportionate 8-month cost of $75,296. So with that, I'm going I have one more slide. Next steps. Tonight, we're not asking you to vote on these. This is just an opportunity for me to share findings and recommendations, you to ask questions. We'd like to bring this back to you on October 22nd, which I believe is your next meeting, and ask you to approve the new classification and pay plan and approve the study recommendations on that night. And if you are able to do that or ready to do that, then we would be able to implement the salary increases and the new salary ranges effective November the 1st. The last thing that you had asked me to do was to look at your personnel policy and to review and make any recommendations for policy changes that might be appropriate. I have not done that because I've been focusing on the other part of the study, but I hope to finish that up this month and perhaps bring recommendations back to you in November for any policy changes that might be appropriate. And now I really am to the last slide, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions you have, any additional information that you'd like to discuss at this time.
First of all, thank you very much, Susan. That was a very comprehensive look at salary, pay, and classification, and it reinforces the decision that the board made to take a look at this and really make sure we're understanding it vis-a-vis the market that we're in. Board questions? Start with Commissioner Burns.
On the below market classifications, you said there were 16, and there's 10 listed. Is that because they're multiple or duplicates?
Could you speak into the microphone?
Or are we missing some?
I thought I had them all. Let's see. The director positions are all grouped
Okay.
together.
Okay,
So,
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted clarification.
yeah, the screen gets really busy when you start listing all those. So I believe all of your director position and the assistant to the town manager position were all below market, except for your Parks and Recreation position, and that one was competitive with the market. So that's where your multiples come from.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Commissioner Westlake?
No questions. I just second what the mayor said. I think this was kind of what we suspected when we discussed it during budget time, and it's good information here. Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Mayor Pro Tem McMillan?
The five that you have way above class of salary classification, and you said to move the salaries down. Now, you're meaning going forward to either leave them where they are without increases, or are you moving them down budget-wise?
I'm not actually reducing anyone's salary. The range is moving down.
The range of the salary is moving
Yeah,
down.
mm-hmm.
So moving forward, the range will be lower than what it has been.
For those five
Currently.
classes. And one of those is a brand-new class, like your fire marshal
Fire marshal.
position.
Right, fire marshal, right.
And I believe for everybody else that is in those ranges, this still gives them plenty of room to continue to get salary increases. So nobody's, none of those in those five classes are topped out at the maximum.
Commissioner Lee? Commissioner DeFinis? I have a question to Mr. Smith and Ms. Davenport. What's your reaction as staff as you took this and consumed this?
I'm in a complete agreement with what she's come back with. We ask a lot of questions.
Speak in the microphone.
I said I am in complete agreement with what she came back with. We ask a lot of questions, and we let the department heads ask a lot of questions, gave them the opportunities, and it's been a pleasure to work with her. She knows what she's doing, and that was very helpful to me. So, yes.
And
I'm happy.
conversely, Wendy has done a great job of getting me a lot of information that I could not have done the study without her, so thank you.
Erskine?
Yeah, just to echo, I think both have done a great job. You know, it's always hard when you're talking to employees about paying class, and some feel left out, some feel elated. But you have to recognize as an organization what you're trying to do is be competitive in the market, number one. And if a person leaves, you're trying to recruit that person to that particular job. It's not that the person that's currently there can be replaced, or you try to separate yourself from that, but it's always important to really on an organizational-wide basis, and I think this is a pretty comprehensive study. I'm surprised it's not more out of alignment since it's been 4 years, but I think that's kudos to the board for allowing some growth within the budget and some merit raises and things like that that built in to keep you competitive in the marketplace. So I think, and that's the goal, to be competitive in the marketplace, because you're always going to have certain positions that you're going to struggle to fill just for the competitive nature of the market, like police officers currently, or engineers if it's a high development market.
So I guess we'll see you on the 22nd then.
I will be here.
And
And if you have questions in the meantime that, you'd like more information on, if you'll get those to Erskine or to Wendy, they'll be happy to either answer them or get information from me. So I know we've given you a lot of information all at one time, but, certainly over the next 2 weeks, if you need additional information or have questions, we'll be happy to respond. And otherwise, hopefully, we'll be back on the 22nd and ask you to take action on the study recommendations.
okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right, before we move on to the second topic, we'll take a quick 5-minute break. Up is Executive Search Firm RFP Distribution for Town Manager position. And welcome back, Wendy.
Thank you. Do not have a PowerPoint. I don't think we need a PowerPoint. But each one of you we were given 10 submittals for the RFP. And I have put together some very simple notes if you'd like to follow along in the red folder. And you may have questions. I need a few responses from you so I will know which way to go. So the RFP was actually released on August 30th. And we asked that the questions be sent to us in written form by September 10th, and we only received one, and I've listed that here, so just trying to keep everybody up to date. And I responded to that per the town attorney's advice. The proposals were due by September 30th, and we received 10 proposals before the due date and none after. So you should have 10, one from each firm. The submissions were received by those that are listed. And after talking with the Mayor Pro Tem, I would suggest that you, as you take these and review them, that you bring back your top 2, maybe 3. I'll ask you what your preference is, by Friday at noon, to let me know. I also put together just a very, very simple sheet that you could make a selection on so everyone can have the same format and turn that in. And I needed to know, I have a couple of questions for you. Would you like to meet to discuss before the October 22nd? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so you would like to set up a date for that, okay?
So, Melody, we have to do the meeting notice within, if we want to do one Friday to have a little work session on all these.
Yes,
We
within
would have to have it
48
out
hours.
before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, for Friday at 10.
That's correct.
Okay. So can we, let's just schedule it now. Is everybody available Friday morning after 10 o'clock?
Today.
The 11th?
The 11th.
You will send that, Melody?
Yes, I'll take care of it.
Okay. All right, so why don't we schedule it for 11 o'clock on Friday morning? And Melody, by tomorrow, when we sign it, just you indicate the room that we're going to be in,
Okay.
whatever's available. I know you're going to have to
Yes,
work around it. Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Okay, also, initially, it was said that I would schedule the interviews the week of the 16th, and so I want to assume that you expect me to continue to do that once you've made your mind up, or chosen your candidates, and I'll notify you of what that schedule would look like. So if there's anything that falls apart as we're talking about it, please let me know. I've already scheduled the community room for.
Did we commit to doing interviews, or did we say if necessary?
If necessary.
Okay.
Yes. So the community room is scheduled for Tuesday and Thursday of next week. At this time, it was available on those 2 days. I need to get from you what you think your suggested interview times would be and the length. Really, we won't know the suggested times until we decide how many firms that you want to interview. But the length of the interviews is something we need to set up for at that time. How long do you
So
want
when we
them
give
to
you that
last?
on Friday?
You can give me that on Friday, that's
Okay.
fine. Just want you to be thinking about that. Also, questions for the interview process. The ICMA has some excellent questions that I will put together for you, if that's okay, and then you all can let me know before the actual interviews what you'd like to change or have adjusted. I would just suggest that we be consistent with that. And then assume you will discuss it again at the October 22nd work session? And that night will award the contract and make your decision, is that correct?
Or prior to that, depending
Okay.
upon what we decide, what the board decides on the 11th, the
Okay.
15th, 17th, depending upon how that all flows.
Okay, that's.
But we committed to, in the RFP, to awarding the contract that week, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that would be that October 22nd date, and then I will notify the search firm if you would like me to continue to do that as was directed before. And in your contents, in the folder, I have also put an extra RFP just for your reference. And then if you have any questions as you go through the timeline, please let me know. And if you have any questions for me now, I'll try my best to answer those.
First of all, thank you to Mayor Pro Tem McMillan and to Wendy for, 10 responses. That's fantastic. So job well done. Gives the board a lot to look at between now and Friday at 11, and hopefully will lead to a good, robust discussion on Friday.
Yes, sir. I believe so.
Okay? All right. Any further questions for Wendy? Anybody? All right. If not, thank you, Wendy.
You're welcome.
And with that, I'll entertain a motion. We have no other business. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor? Anybody opposed?